Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you very much for the plug. Yes, do read it. It's not what I'm going to talk about today, however. I'm going to talk about exploring school-to-work transitions. And what I actually want to do first and mostly is to try and put the concrete problems that our young people face in a more international, global, historical context. Because, as I suspect everybody in this room is aware, our economy, and by that I mean the economy of the West, not just of the UK, has changed dramatically in recent years. And that's why many of our institutions are struggling to catch up and to adapt, and why the sort of world in which I grew up, in which really and truly, when you left school, if you wanted a job, it wasn't that hard to get one, is not the one that is facing our young people today. So today's world, it's a world in which education is a vast, vast enterprise, in which staying on in education full-time to 18 is the norm. It's what the vast majority of young people do, and many of them, to be honest, would probably rather not, but they feel quite rightly that if they don't have much hope of getting anywhere in life. But it's also one in which there's been a huge change in the structure of the labour market. And what has disappeared in pretty well every developed country is the old youth labour market, the labour market in which there were jobs for 15, 16, 17-year-olds, and that was seen as a normal way of entering the world, in which the idea that everybody stayed in full-time education to 18 would have seemed a rather strange one. And this has been quite recent in the UK. We actually held to the old patterns for longer than most other European and developed countries. And I mean, I actually remember going to France back in the early 1990s and spending quite a lot of time there, and coming back and thinking, well, I put it slightly more graphically, they have really messed up their youth labour market. Because at that point, if you were a young French person, it was already incredibly hard to get a stable job, whether you left school at 16 or 18 or even after university. But what I saw in France was really a precursor, because since then, for a variety of reasons, the old youth labour market, the world in which you could get a perfectly good, stable job in a good firm with prospects at 16 has gone. And one of the things that's actually quite interesting, which you can see here as a result, is how it's actually been quite a rapid change in this country. The percentage in full-time education, which is in 1994, you can see it's down here, age 16 is blue, age 17 is red. Just in the course of less than 20 years, way less than 20 years, you've got this big rise, and you're getting to the point where essentially, let's be honest, you are having a baby or have disappeared off the map or generally are doing something which everybody around you would rather you didn't, you will be in full-time education at 16, and even at 17 those numbers are creeping right up. And you can see the challenge to the system in terms of what this means, in terms of just the numbers that people have had to incorporate. And perhaps it's not a surprise that some of our institutions have struggled, given the huge increase in just the sheer numbers of young people that they've had to cater for in the last 10 years, 15 years, as these large numbers come through who in the past would have been in the workplace, holding down perfectly good, stable jobs, and are now either in full-time education or, even more worryingly, going in and out from unstable short-term jobs to courses which they don't really find satisfactory, then back out for a part-time job and back in again. And this back and forth movement is what has most characterized the least successful, most disadvantaged 16 to 18-year-olds. It's not true that there are hundreds of thousands of kids out there sitting on sofas watching movies all day long. What you've got is actually something which I think is in a way much more tragic, which is this back and forth and back and forth. And that's actually in the report that I did for the government, the thing that took me back most when we actually looked at the numbers was the number of young people for whom this was their experience between age 16 and 19. And the other thing which sort of is the flip side of this, and you'll be able to see these when Anthony posts them in more detail, because I'm not going to spend ages explaining what each number is, but the important bit is that the green is shrinking. And the green, first of all, there are far more people in education, but secondly, of those who are in education, far fewer of them are in part-time education. And this is actually very important because I think, again, there's a folk memory, or for people who are my age, a real memory, of the days when day release was a normal pattern. You got a job, and whether or not you were formally an apprentice, you actually were usually paid for by the employer. You went to your local technical college and you went for a day or 2 days or evenings or anything of that sort. And my father was actually governor of our local technical college when I was growing up. I didn't go to it. I went to grammar school, of course. But that was the pattern. That was the pattern that characterized the transitions into the labour market of people of my age, going on for a little bit longer, people who were older, and which actually basically collapsed in the 1980s. And so now that old style day release is almost non-existent. That little green bit would be a few apprentices hanging on by their fingertips. But this old pattern, which was in many ways very satisfactory, has just gone, and that's why that green bit is vanishing. So far more young people, far less day release. Now, the other thing that we all know is that youth unemployment has gone up. But what I want to show you here, and this is all really part of what I'm doing, I will come to a few fairly obvious suggestions at the end, but what I'm trying to do this morning is sort of give some context for what we're trying to do, what we're grappling with, and what you'll be talking about during the day. What I've shown you there is something that's quite interesting, and it's for the UK, but it would be a similar pattern for any of our European neighbours except Denmark and Germany, which I'll come to later. What you can see there in recent years is a big increase in the unemployment rate and a very stable pattern for those who are unemployed as a proportion of the age group. So what we're actually saying is it's not that a larger proportion of 16-year-olds are unemployed, it's that a larger proportion of those who are trying to get a job are unemployed. So you've got these two patterns. It's harder and harder to get a job if you want one at 16, but relatively few people are unemployed because even though you've got this rising unemployment rate among those trying to get it, the proportion who are unemployed as a proportion of the age group is staying stable because everybody else is giving up and going back into education. If you can't get a job, you stay in education. And actually, when you hear these horrendous figures, by the way, for sort of Spanish unemployment, it's actually a similar pattern. It's actually not that 25% of 17-year-old Spaniards are trying to get jobs. Most of them aren't trying, they've given up. But of those who are trying, it's actually well over 25%, I think, by now. But those who are trying are finding that it's just impossible. And what you then find, and just to show you this as a flip side of the same sort of thing, that is the proportion of the age group who are employed. And the proportion of the age group who are employed has been going down steadily, way before the current recession. Well, the last recession, I guess, we're out of it. But look, this way predates 2008. This is not a 2008 crash phenomenon. This is something that's been happening for much longer. Basically, 16 and 17-year-olds can't get jobs. The other thing, which is, I think, in many ways even more worrying, is that we've got this high structural unemployment for 18 to 24-year-olds. Now, in some ways, it's easier to deal with this in that somebody who's come out of education at 18 is seen by most employers as employable, at least in the first year or two, in a way that 16 and 17-year-olds who've been shuttling back and forth often aren't. But although I think it's, in principle, I'm starting to wonder this a little, but more amenable to policy interventions, easier to do something about than it is with this group of 16 and 17-year-olds who are really struggling and who usually did very badly in their GCSEs. It is very damaging. Being unemployed when you first hit the labour market, being unemployed when you're 18 to 24, is something which casts a long shadow. You can follow this because we have fantastic longitudinal data in this country for which we have to thank successive governments, and I'm glad to say they're still doing it. So we can actually find out what happens to people, and what we find out is that somebody in their 50s will still be marked by whether or not they had a really tough time in the period from age 18 to 24 and whether or not they got stable employment at that point. It still casts a shadow 30 years later. And this is the other thing that I wanted to show you, which is that here what you're getting a rise in unemployment, not just as a proportion of those seeking the job, but as a proportion of the age group. And that's the bit that's, if you like, really worrying, because that is new, that's post-2008. and it seems to be, although obviously it's improving in the last year or two, this seems to be an area where we're hitting real problems, where it's not coming down among the young as fast as you, and by this I mean now the 18 to 24-year-olds, it's not coming down as fast as you would expect from historical experience or as you would hope given what's happening to the economy. So today, and I think this is the important thing, we are typical of developed economies in many ways. We're not an outlier. The outliers are Germany and Denmark, by the way, and as I said, I'll come back to that in a minute, and there's no great mystery about why, like apprenticeships. But the problems of transition are general and they're quite intractable. What I've put up here, as I said, all of these slides will be available, I mean, because these are numbers, but if you're sort of interested in it afterwards. One of the things that's sort of interesting here is, again, just look at the shapes. Because with a single exception of the Netherlands, pretty much, what has happened in the last couple of decades is that all over the rich world, and these are OECD countries, the proportion of the population, the young population who is in employment, has been falling. As I said, this is not a particularly English thing, it's not just a French thing, it's a general pattern. We were unusually high. That very high blue bar, that was us not that long ago. We're now down at levels which are, we've had a particularly sharp drop, but essentially what you can see there, and what you're going to see in quite a lot of the things that I show, is that actually when you look at OECD countries, when you look at rich countries, what is striking is actually most often the similarities of pattern, not the differences on which we all tend to get hung up. We're all obsessed with league tables, so are we behind Finland? Are we ahead of Germany? Is Italy coming up on the right-hand side? But actually, when you look at the developed world, what tends to strike you is that a lot of this is really quite similar across it. And again, ratio of youth unemployment rate to adult employment rate, again, you get some outliers. I don't know what was going on in Italy a while ago. I have suspicions that it probably had something to do with taxes and whether you registered people, but But again, the reality is that the rate of youth unemployment to adult unemployment is always high. The young are always more likely to be having trouble than adults are. Again, what you see there is that you see that everybody is actually in pretty much the same rather depressing area. They're basically sort of 2 to 3 times as high is very common everywhere. So again, we're not particularly unusual, though we're particularly unusual in having had a sharp rise. But again, what you can see is that this is an intractable problem. It's a problem that goes on, and it's a problem where nobody seems to have cracked it. Germany is the best, again. Usual answer. And that's again just for your records, with acknowledgements to a colleague of mine who actually put this up in that way. And essentially, since I don't have a pointer, I'm going to actually show you where the UK is. It's there. Kind of bang in the middle, really. Again, scant reading skills. I don't know if this was Payek or not. Yes, of course, it's a worry. Are we hugely much worse than everybody else? Not obviously. Again, that's us in the middle there, sort of 2 in from the 3 in from the right. Bit below the EU average, worse than the Netherlands, bit better than France apparently, much the same as the Germans. It's not that high. It's between 10 and 20% pretty much, except for Finland. Yes, it's a worry. Are we uniquely bad? Is this a sign that, there is something incredibly rotten in the state of Britain's schools? Not obviously. Don't mean they can't get better, but we're not outliers. And we're also, as again, I suspect everybody knows, we are not outliers in the percentage of the population that has graduated from some form of higher education. We actually have a higher number of university graduates than most people because all our higher education sector is universities pretty much. But again, we are a very average sort of place for a developing country in many ways. And in a sense, that means that perhaps we shouldn't beat up on ourselves. But on the other, it sort of underlines how intractable some of these problems are. And then something else where actually we, again, are not that unusual, but where I do actually want to flag up the decline, is in the percentage of all students who are in mathematics, science and technology subjects. And I do think this is an issue, and perhaps I can just say in passing, because it's not to do with today's event really, that my own university, King's, is starting to do its own very small bit about this, and that we're opening a 16 to 19 mathematics school, specialist mathematics school. So if this is a subject that's close to your heart, do go and look up King's Maths School, because this is our own small contribution to it, but very much at the top end of the STEM things. And again, unemployment rates, yes, bad, not particularly bad. This is again another way of looking at some of the data that I've shown you. It's bad, it's not hugely much worse than most other places. But at this point, I do want to highlight, well, the Netherlands, which is slightly different, and that's partly because they have very, very long schooling. But I do at this point want to highlight the two obvious ones, which are Denmark and Germany, Deutschland, so DNK and DEU, because they obviously have a much lower unemployment rate. And the reason they have a much lower unemployment rate is because they have a hugely developed apprenticeship system. And this is not an original observation, but what is true about this country is that we once had a rather good functioning apprenticeship system. I think Anthony would agree with that. Perhaps not. Well, I think it was much maligned. The government of the day set out to destroy it on the grounds that it wasn't fair, that it was time served, that access wasn't equal. I think it was absolutely an appalling act of vandalism, not that they knew it was, and we are still bearing the brunt of that mistake. So we don't have, in my view, a functioning apprenticeship system at the moment, although we have a lot of apparently so-called apprentices. So Germany is the best known positive outlier, although they too have labour market challenges. And because I'm going to turn in a minute to apprenticeship, which is a sort of familiar trope among sort of people in this room, I do realise this, but I do also want to sort of point out that it's not because a manufacturing economy solves everything. It's not because somehow there's something incredibly virtuous about the whole of the German economy. They have a very, very, very good set of institutions at the apprenticeship end, but they are not a different sort of country from us in essentials. They really are not. They also have a hugely high unemployment rate for anybody who hasn't completed a full apprenticeship. That's the top one. Again, acknowledgements to a colleague of mine from Oxford University for this one. I didn't create this chart. Essentially, what you're getting there is if you can see the top one, that's people who don't have a full complete apprenticeship with the qualification, who therefore are classified as not having a formal sort of top-end qualification at all. Their unemployment rate is extremely high. And then further down, you've got the sort of the how do I describe it? You've got the upper high school leaving certificates, and you've got the you've got higher education general qualifications, and the ones that he's put in red are the ones from the high level, the sort of the graduate level, technical, vocational, what we mostly translate as polytechnics, but they're not really like our polytechnics ever were. And interestingly enough, that just shows you again unemployment overall. This was IAB panel study, no qualification. Further training, higher education. You are still getting higher unemployment among those who just have a complete vocational award than you are those who have higher education and further training. But what is interesting is that what they are experiencing is the other part of the problem, which you're not going to be talking about much today, but that one of the things that's happening all over the developed world is that faced with this labour market, people pile into higher education, and you've got declining returns to general undergraduate bachelor's degrees. And this is now a phenomenon everywhere. It's a particularly clear phenomenon in Germany. They have they've had very prolonged bachelor's degrees. They're now trying to bring them down to 3 years in line with the rest, 3 or 4 years in line with the rest of Europe as part of the Bologna process. But they are seen as not very satisfactory. The Germans are not happy with the nature of their higher education system, particularly the universities, and they are basically in a situation where more and more people feel they're forced to take master's degrees because those are seen as the labour market currency transition. And then you have selective access, and generally it's a problem. And I think this is quite interesting, and I just wanted to put it up again with acknowledgements. Because what is interesting, I think, is that they've been desperately trying to shorten their their degrees. I once heard, earlier this week actually, I heard somebody saying happily that the average age of undergraduates in German universities proved that they were doing better at letting people have second chances. No, it just means that they're hanging around there forever, I'm afraid. And the interesting thing is that although they've now introduced short bachelor degrees, those actually are not proving to be anything like as effective a transition to the labour market as the old ones, or than the Fachhochschule, which are the higher technical institutes. So these are real problems in the current labour market at both ends. The Germans don't have the same problem at the lower end as we do. They have, I would say, worse problems at the university graduate end. So what is the background to all of this somewhat depressing story? Though I do have to point out that most people are in employment. Most of us do have jobs. It's not like nobody is making a transition. Most of my students graduate from King's and go into jobs, and it's better now than it was in 2008. But there has been some major changes, some really major changes. And again, I'm sure most people have heard the phrase "the hourglass economy," and again, I don't want to exaggerate it. Steve McIntosh at Sheffield, who I think, again, many people will know his work, he's one of the people who sort of demonstrated quite clearly how the big differences between the prospects you get if you've been an apprentice from if you've just done out of work qualifications. And he sort of looked at the numbers. And so it's not sort of quite like that, but it is like this, that the skilled jobs in the middle have been shrinking in number, and there's no reason to suppose that this will change. And the huge increase in professional, white-collar, middle-class jobs, which took just whole generations out of the working class into the middle class, that has not entirely stopped, but it's slowed. Again, there was this amazing post-war period, especially in mainland Europe, les Trente Glorieuses, when everything was going right. The economy was booming, the job structure was changing, people were moving into towns and cities and getting good jobs, kids were staying in school, getting some qualifications, taking jobs their parents couldn't have dreamt of. We don't have that. We have all the things which are familiar to us now, where we've got a shrinkage in the number in the middle and a large number of jobs which are low-paid service jobs and which really don't demand technical skills. They demand soft skills, and therefore they may have some prospects, but a lot of them really don't. Now, these are not particularly problems for the young, of course. What is a problem, I think, for the sorts of kids who used to go into apprenticeships, particularly, is the decline in manufacturing all over the West. And I love this graph because it was a slight surprise to me because I was actually in a rush. And so I didn't have time to put all the points in. And when you put all the points in the middle in, it actually looks much messier. But when you just do these two end points, what is extraordinary is that the top line is Germany, the middle line is the UK, and the bottom line is France. And although Germany is at the top at both ends, what you can see there is that in terms of what is happening to our economies, the same thing is happening everywhere. This is actually a world in which manufacturing, maybe it'll come back in 15 to 20 years, but at the moment, we're in a phase where manufacturing is shrinking throughout the developed world as a share of GDP. And of course, it's also shrinking fantastically as a share of employment because it's so efficient. Manufacturing is doing what agriculture did. You just don't need the people. I was up in the Northeast. I did a fascinating program because I do a program called Analysis sometimes for Radio 4, and I did one up in the Northeast in Newcastle. And again, what was so extraordinary was just looking at the numbers that would be employed in, say, the Vickers Works, as opposed to the number that are employed in Nissan, which is a phenomenally successful company. And they just, the numbers are just not comparable. So this is not going to be a major source of employment. And the things that are growing fastest in terms of numbers, there's always this difference between percentage growth and absolute growth. And if you look at the national figures, people will tell you things like the fastest growing occupations are things like conservation officer and paramedic and town planner. In fact, those were the top three when I did my report from the National Commission. They're the ones down on the left. Yeah, they're growing fastest. The ones that actually have the largest growth in absolute numbers are the ones on the right. And those are education assistants, care assistants, and what was the other one? Marketing and sales managers, which I suppose is not so bad, but it's not quite the picture that you often get. So what have we got here? We've got a situation in which the labour market participation of people is, it's not that we're all out of the labour market, but if you look at young people, if you look at, for example, the 18 to 24, which is the green group, which I think is the one that, in a sense, concerns me most, what you can see there is that you've actually got a much higher unemployment rate, that's the middle bit, and you've actually got a much lower proportion employed. Now, some of those are in full-time education, but a lot of that reflects this really problematic transition that not just 16 and 17-year-olds have. They're kind of, I'm afraid, just stuck with education or hopefully apprenticeship as well as education, but we're not going to bring back the world in which employers take 16 or 17-year-olds because they basically, even if they don't admit it, figure that if a 17-year-old is looking for a job, he's probably or she's probably not the sort of 17-year-old they want anyway. But the other thing which is actually, I think, really worrying is the incidence of long-term unemployment among young people. Now, it's not that long, of course, because when you're 16 or 17, you can't have been employed that long. But what you're getting is, it's not that most of them are long-term unemployed, but quite a lot of them are. That middle one, that middle bar. They shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be long-term unemployed. We should be making sure that 18 to 24-year-olds get something that really helps them fast. So, in some areas of this country, we've got unemployment rates twice as high. We've got a lot of churning, lots of short-term jobs. We know that unemployment scars permanently in many cases, and we know that high-quality progression routes are not available to many young people. We also know that employers use education, even though on the one hand they will many times say quite rightly we're looking for soft skills, we're looking for teamwork, we're looking for this, we're looking for that. The reality, how they behave, what our longitudinal studies show us, what our employment statistics show us, is that they use formal education as a screening device. They basically say, I'm going to select from that pool that's got qualifications and that has finished courses because A, they probably won't be dismally badly educated because nobody ever believes that education is any good. But also we know that they have the character to stick it out. And I think one shouldn't underestimate the degree to which employers use formal qualifications, not as a signal of skills, but as a signal of character. And so the reality is that even though when you talk to people, they say, we don't care about formal qualifications, we don't care about this, we don't care about that. Always look at what people do, not what they say. And the reality is that employers use formal education, formal courses, formal qualifications as a screening device and as a ranking device. So we know that people are completely aware of this from the fact that they all keep going into higher education in spite of everything. Now, the returns to higher education may have dropped, but it's still a better bet than not having it. And I was quite sure that the fees wouldn't make any difference, and I turned out to be right. Because from the point of view of a young person, yes, of course you don't want to pay the fees, but you need a job. And you feel, looking at the modern labour market quite rightly, that if you've got any chance of getting a degree, it's probably a really good idea to do it because you're going to be better off than if you aren't. Now, some young people find jobs, find them, don't want to go to university, will tell you volubly how much better off they are than their friends, how they've got 3 years of work under their belts when their friends have just been faffing around, running up debts and partying. But the reality is that for most young people, higher education is a safe bet if they can get into it, if they feel they're equipped not to actually succeed. And returns to a degree have remained high. And the interesting thing is that although England has the highest fees, it also has the highest application rate. So it hasn't been. And then that brings us to apprenticeship. Because I do think that while it's not the be-all and end-all of everything, we have to try and recreate a good apprenticeship system for young people in this country. This is not an original remedy, but the more I look at the labour market, the more I look at what has happened to other attempts, programs, initiatives over the last 20, 30 years, the more I feel that this is actually something that we have another chance, maybe the last chance, to really resuscitate something that was part of the English system. And it's extraordinarily important that we do so, because where good apprenticeships have survived, they have both been highly desired by young people. I mean, the idea that young people don't want apprenticeships is laughable. You know, I was in Wirral the other week, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's principal of college there, and they'd had 2 or 3 good craft apprenticeships advertised. The employers came to them and said, put it out on the college network. And they had within, 12 hours, literally hundreds of applications for each of those. And I have to say that, well, I don't know if the depressing thing, perhaps the predictable thing was that the 3 apprenticeships concerned, one went indeed to a 17-year-old. She was doing A-levels, dropped her A-levels to take it. One went to somebody who had actually been in higher education and had come out and actually had a degree, a fairly useless degree, I have to say. But she said it was a fairly useless degree, and I had to agree with her, but she nonetheless had a degree. And only the third one went to somebody that you would think of as a sort of a typical, the only male, but a sort of a typical apprentice. So the problem is that over the last 10, 15, 20 years, having tried to abolish apprenticeships in the 1980s, we then government revived the term, created a program which, in my view, was utterly dysfunctional, and I've written about that at great length, and anyway, hopefully it's going, so never mind, in which you had targets for things that were called apprenticeships, but that mostly weren't. And some of these turned into major scandals with training companies being closed down eventually by the government, and supermarket chains doing apprenticeships in shelf stacking, and generally. The problem has been that we've had this program, and we're now having to try and unpack and And again, we've had these theoretical apprenticeship numbers, but what has happened is that more and more of them have gone to adults, and the key 16 to 18-year-old numbers have held at best constant. Many of these are very low quality. The growth has been among older people and above all among adults who are already in employment. A lot of so-called apprentices are people who are already in employment, and they simply are called apprentices so you can get the training money. And generally this has not been functional. And as you can see there, a big the number of apprenticeships going to 16 to 18-year-olds, or indeed to those under 19, including 18-year-olds, is a small proportion of the whole. And yet they're the people who need it. We need the 17-year-olds, we need the 18-year-olds to go into apprenticeship, because this is, after all, a 3 and a 4 year program. I mean, this is when they start. So what you're seeing there is a whole generation where the apprenticeship numbers have been moving away from the group that needs them most. So we do have apprenticeship reform happening at the moment. Doug Richard wrote, in my view, a really good report. But its success is not guaranteed. It is absolutely up to employers. I mean, a really important thing happened in the autumn statement, which was that it was confirmed that employers would indeed once again be the people who took over and ran apprenticeship, in the sense that they were the ones who decided where the money went. And that was a dramatic shift from the last 15 to 20 years, and one where I think there was I know there was a lot of fighting inside government about it. But anyway, they've done it. But also that means that it is now up to employers. If this is going to work, if this is going to be revived, if this is going to be something which actually enables us to be like Germany and Denmark, rather than like Italy in terms of what is available for our 18-year-olds, it is now over to employers. Briefly, we know that if you get a vocational qualification as part of an apprenticeship, it pays. And if you get a vocational award in a work scheme or even in a college, then it mostly won't be worth anything to you. And this is something which, again, my own research was part of the mounting evidence that this was the case. We still have problems in the system, but I think the main problem has been the middle bullet, that as apprenticeship has declined, more and more of the less qualified have been channeled into schemes where they notionally get vocational training and awards, but the ones that they get are visibly in the data not something that employers rate. They rate vocational awards that have been gained by apprentices and people gaining them while on the job, the sort of thing that used to happen in the old day release world. So there's a whole pile of stuff going on. We've got new programs for 16 to 18-year-olds that prioritise work experience. Again, these will work as well or as badly as employers help them with to a degree. Absolutely, this is something where it's hard. Okay, it's about your future workforce, but it's not necessarily that particular kid you're going to employ. So, colleges have been are working very, very hard. There are traineeships with subsidised work experience. There are some wage subsidies going around, which there's apprenticeship reform, which I think is the most important, which has barely started yet. There's qualification reform for 16 to 18-year-olds. So it's not that nothing is happening, and some of this is my responsibility or my fault. But it's a hostile world into which we're putting these programs. I mean, a lot of the labour market change is making it hard. And I think the things that I would say at the moment is that work experience placements, the pilots are encouraging. Wage subsidies are mostly a failure so far, but that's usually the case. It's partly the sort of the domination of the economic model, which doesn't allow for time and complexity and noise and all the rest of it. They usually don't work. It's not just us that don't work. Qualification reform, we always reform qualifications. Just do it. Just get used to it. It's kind of like we do fish and chips and qualification reform. English and maths, I think this will be good in the long term. It's not going to solve the 18-year-old unemployment problem, but it has to be good for the nation's skill base in the long term. And apprenticeship reform, which is too early to tell, but it's both key and it's difficult. But what I want to finish by saying in terms of this conference today and its incredibly important area, and I do want to also say how great it is that Anthony keeps on about this and keeps on at this and doesn't let us forget about it, is that workplace experience for the young is absolutely critical. Apprenticeship pays because apprentices have been in the workplace. It's not, lots of apprentices don't stay for life in the job where they served an apprenticeship. Some of them do, but many of them don't. And, again, sort of the tired joke that the biggest employer of bakers in Bavaria is BMW. It's true, of course. But many of them will stay, and many of them will, because again, I don't know about other people, but my experience of the job market, and most people's experience of the job market, is that you move a little bit sideways and a little bit sideways. So you may end up 4 jobs on, quite a long way from where you started, but it's not random. And that's also true of people who go through apprenticeships. They may not stay with the same company, many of them won't, they may not stay with exactly the same trade, but they have a combination of skills and workplace experience and credibility and people whom they can get references from, which is absolutely critical. And essentially the other thing we need to do is, if we think of this as a sliding scale in which apprenticeship is sort of the gold standard, what we need to do is to try and build up things which are a little bit lower down that scale, but which have the same characteristics. So, starting at the top, Saturday jobs have vanished. I mean, how many people here had a Saturday job when they were? If I asked that in a group of people who were all over 50, it would be a total sea of hands. If I asked people who were mostly 22 or 23, hardly any would put their hands up. And if you asked 15 and 16-year-olds now, almost nobody. This is really bad news in every way. It's bad news in learning about work. It's bad news in making your career choices. It's bad news in terms of having an employer that you can give as a reference. It's really bad news, and the Saturday job has gone for a variety of reasons. We need people to have substantial work experience. We need them to have it at various points. I controversially said I didn't think that a week after GCSEs was the top priority in life. I still don't. I think that in terms of where schools and colleges need to put their efforts, and where they are now putting their efforts, is in getting chunks of good quality work experience for the 16 to 18-year-olds who are now all in education pretty much. They're not leaving after GCSE, they're staying in education. They need chunks of experience. Traineeships are not something on which I'm an expert. I think the argument that, again, let's try for those who are most at risk to get really good work placements with employers, make that the top priority is absolutely right. Apprenticeships again. But all of this and particularly the first and the second, if you like, in various guises, you can only do it if employers will do it. And if they won't, we are going to have a lost generation. So thank you very much, and I'm delighted that everybody is here because that's a sort of commitment which is kind of encouraging. And I'm happy to take a question or two if there's time, and if not, to hand over to what look like some really, really interesting sessions.